I met Trevor 12 years ago at Lincoln High School, where he worked as an ASL interpreter. I was there picking up my nephew Mason after he'd gotten himself suspended for the third time that semester. The office was in complete chaos. Their computer system had crashed, and nobody could print the paperwork I needed to sign. While the secretary was having a complete meltdown, Trevor quietly stepped over and fixed whatever technical disaster they were dealing with in about 2 minutes. I was impressed. Here was this competent, helpful guy who actually knew how to solve problems instead of just standing around complaining about them. He was tall, had kind eyes, and there was something refreshing about his calm demeanor in the middle of all that office drama. When he handed me the printed forms with a smile, I made my decision right there. "Thank you for helping me out," I said, making sure to hold his gaze. "I'd love to take you out for coffee sometime." The poor guy looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He actually stammered when he said yes, which I found adorable. I could tell immediately that he wasn't used to women approaching him, probably spent most of his time with teenagers and other teachers in his little educational bubble. It was exactly what I was looking for at that point in my life. Someone genuine, stable, and clearly grateful for my attention. Our first date confirmed everything I'd suspected. Trevor showed up 15 minutes early, wearing his nicest button-down shirt, and kept thanking me for asking him out like I'd done him some incredible favor. When the bill came, he reached for his wallet with this earnest expression. But I stopped him. "Don't worry about it. I invited you." The relief and gratitude in his eyes told me everything I needed to know about his financial situation. He was sweet about it, though, promising to get the next one, already assuming there would be a next one. I liked that confidence. Even if it was probably the first time in his life he'd shown any. Dating Trevor was easy in all the best ways. He was attentive without being clingy, supportive of my career ambitions, and genuinely interested in hearing about my day. I was working in project management at a consulting firm, pulling in decent money and climbing the ladder fast. Trevor would listen to my work stories with the same focused attention he probably gave his students, asking thoughtful questions and celebrating my wins like they were his own. He introduced me to his grandfather Harold after about 6 months. The old man was polite enough, but I could sense his skepticism. Harold had raised Trevor after his parents died, and he clearly had some old-fashioned ideas about relationships and women. I didn't let it bother me. Elderly people from his generation always needed time to warm up to independent, successful women. 2 years in, Trevor proposed with his grandmother's ring and this whole romantic speech about building a future together. The proposal was sweet, traditional, exactly what I'd hoped for. We started planning a wedding immediately, and I have to admit, I enjoyed every minute of it. Trevor was happy to let me make most of the decisions, which worked perfectly since I actually had opinions about flowers and venues and all those details he couldn't have cared less about. The night before our wedding, Harold pulled Trevor aside for one of their grandfather-grandson talks. I couldn't hear what they were discussing, but I caught Trevor's expression when he came back, troubled, conflicted. When I asked him about it, he just shook his head and said his grandfather was worried about him getting married so young. I figured it was just typical old person anxiety about change. Our first 4 years of marriage were genuinely good. We settled into a comfortable routine. I focused on advancing my career while Trevor did his teaching thing. He was proud of my success, always bragging to his colleagues about my latest promotion or project win. I appreciated having a husband who wasn't threatened by my ambition, who actually encouraged me to pursue bigger opportunities. Trevor was an excellent partner in all the practical ways. He handled most of the household management since my job required longer hours and travels. He never complained about my schedule or made me feel guilty for prioritizing work. When I came home stressed about deadlines or difficult clients, he'd listen patiently and offer perspective without trying to solve everything for me. But then Trevor started bringing up children. It started casually, comments about cute kids we'd see in restaurants, mentions of his students' progress, little hints about someday when we have our own family. I deflected at first, figuring he'd get the hint that I wasn't ready to discuss it seriously. But Trevor kept pushing the topic, getting more direct about wanting to start a family. Finally, he cornered me one evening with a whole speech about how much he wanted to be a father, how great we'd be as parents, how he'd always dreamed of having kids of his own. I realized I needed to shut this down before it went any further. "Trevor, I'm not ready for children," I told him. "My career is just hitting its stride. What if something happens to me and I can't work, and we have to depend on your income? We'd be living in poverty?" He looked hurt, but I wasn't finished. The whole conversation was bringing out some truths that needed to be said. And honestly, what if the child ends up like one of those kids in your class? I'm not equipped to handle that kind of situation. Kids would slow down my career completely, and I'm not willing to sacrifice everything I've worked for. Trevor went quiet after that. Really quiet. He didn't bring up children again. But something fundamental shifted between us. He became more distant, less enthusiastic about our future plans. The easy intimacy we'd shared started disappearing. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd eventually understand my perspective and appreciate that I was being realistic about our limitations. But Trevor seemed to take my honesty as some kind of personal rejection. He started treating me like I'd crushed his dreams instead of just being practical about our situation. The physical side of our marriage suffered the most. Trevor's romantic interest dropped off dramatically after our conversation about children. He stopped initiating intimacy, stopped those casual touches and affectionate gestures that had always been natural for him. When I tried to reconnect physically, he'd go through the motions, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. By our 6th year of marriage, we were intimate maybe once a year, usually on his birthday, when he'd had a few drinks and could apparently forget his resentment long enough to function as a husband. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that we had other important connections. But the rejection stung more than I wanted to admit. Trevor threw himself deeper into his work, spending extra hours at school and taking on additional responsibilities. He started talking about his students constantly, sharing their achievements like a proud parent. It was obvious he was channeling all his paternal instincts into his job, since I made it clear that wasn't happening at home. I focused on my own career advancement, earning promotion after promotion and building an impressive professional reputation. My income nearly tripled during those years, while Trevor's teacher salary remained basically stagnant. The financial gap between us widened significantly, which should have made him more grateful for my contributions, but instead he seemed almost resentful of my success. By our 9th year of marriage, we were essentially roommates who shared a mortgage. We were polite to each other, coordinated our schedules efficiently, but the emotional connection had completely evaporated. Trevor would spend his evenings grading papers or preparing lessons while I worked on my laptop or caught up with friends. We'd have dinner together maybe twice a week, and even then the conversation was purely logistical. That's when I met David. He was brought in as a consultant on one of my major projects. Brilliant. Successful. Actually, on my intellectual level, David had an MBA from Northwestern, drove a BMW, wore expensive suits that fit him perfectly. When he walked into our conference room for the first time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine attraction to someone who was clearly in my league. David noticed me immediately. During breaks, he'd seek me out for conversation, asking thoughtful questions about my role in the project and complimenting my insights. He treated me like an equal, like someone worth impressing. Instead of just taking my competence for granted the way Trevor did, we started having coffee during project meetings, then extended those conversations over lunch. David was everything Trevor wasn't: sophisticated, ambitious, financially successful. He understood the pressures of high-level professional life because he lived them too. When I complained about Trevor's lack of ambition or his contentment with mediocrity, David actually got it. "You're wasted in that situation," he told me one afternoon. "Someone with your drive and intelligence deserves a partner who matches your energy." It felt incredible to be seen and appreciated by someone who actually understood what I brought to the table. David made me remember what it felt like to be desired, to be pursued by someone who had options and chose me anyway. The emotional affair developed naturally over several months. We'd text throughout the day, share inside jokes, complain about our respective home situations. David was married too, but his wife was apparently some boring suburban mom type who didn't understand his professional world. He felt as trapped and unappreciated as I did. When David suggested we meet for drinks after work, I knew we were crossing a line, but honestly, I felt like I deserved some happiness after years of being taken for granted. Trevor certainly wasn't meeting my emotional needs, and I was tired of feeling invisible in my own marriage. That first evening at the hotel bar changed everything. David was attentive, charming, made me feel beautiful and interesting again. When he suggested we get a room, I barely hesitated. I'd been starving for real intimacy for so long that being with someone who actually wanted me felt like coming back to life. We started meeting regularly, always at the Marriott downtown, always in the afternoon when Trevor was at work and wouldn't question my schedule. I told him I was shopping, meeting girlfriends, handling errands. Trevor never questioned my explanations because he trusted me completely, which honestly made the whole thing easier. David and I fell into a comfortable routine. Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4, sometimes Saturdays if I could arrange the right alibi. The physical connection was incredible after years of feeling rejected and unwanted. David made me feel sexy and desirable again, reminded me that I was still an attractive, vibrant woman, despite Trevor's apparent indifference. But more than the physical aspect, David provided the intellectual and emotional stimulation I'd been missing. We'd spend hours talking about our careers, our ambitions, our frustrations with our mediocre spouses. He understood my drive in a way Trevor never could, supported my goals without making me feel guilty for prioritizing success. I got careless after a few months. The thrill of having this secret, exciting part of my life made me bold. I stopped worrying so much about covering my tracks perfectly because Trevor was so oblivious to anything outside his little teaching world. He never questioned my explanations, never seemed suspicious of my increased absences. That last week in particular, I was feeling especially confident. David and I had met Tuesday afternoon for our usual session. Then again Thursday, Saturday. I arranged to meet him again by telling Trevor I was spending the afternoon with my sister Jessica, listening to her complain about her marriage problems. Jessica's having another crisis with Mark. I told Trevor that Saturday morning. I promised I'd come over and help her work through it. Trevor nodded absently, probably already thinking about whatever weekend project he had planned. He never questioned my sister visits because he found Jessica annoying and was happy to avoid those conversations entirely. Saturday's meeting with David was perfect. We had the whole afternoon, no rush, no pressure. He'd brought wine, and we spent hours talking about maybe taking a weekend trip together, somewhere we could actually relax without watching the clock. I felt happier and more alive than I had in years. I came home that evening feeling satisfied and energized. Trevor was in the living room, watching some documentary about marine biology. Barely acknowledged my return. I went straight upstairs for a shower, looking forward to washing off the afternoon and getting comfortable. I was standing under the hot water, still thinking about David's hands on my skin, when Trevor walked into the bathroom. That was unusual. He always knocked first, always respected my privacy, but he just opened the door and stood there holding his phone. "I know you were at the Marriott downtown," he said in this eerily calm voice. "I know you've been there 3 times this week." The words hit me like ice water. For a second, I couldn't process what he was saying. Trevor was standing there with some kind of tracking app open on his phone, showing my car's location history. Tuesday at 4 p.m., Marriott. Thursday at 4 p.m., Marriott. Saturday at 3 p.m., Marriott. What the hell is this? I screamed, grabbing a towel. "You're tracking me. Are you completely insane?" But Trevor didn't react to my outrage the way he usually did. He just stood there with that same calm expression, like he'd been preparing for this moment. "You told me you were with Jessica today," he continued, "but Jessica's been in Springfield all weekend with Mark's family. I called her looking for you." The betrayal was unbelievable. My own sister had thrown me under the bus, and my husband had turned into some kind of controlling stalker. This was exactly the kind of psychotic behavior I should have expected from someone so insecure and possessive. "You're sick," I yelled at him. "What kind of person spies on their wife like this? You're controlling and paranoid, and I can't believe you violated my privacy this way." Trevor just nodded like he'd expected that response. "I filed for divorce yesterday," he said. "You'll be served at work on Monday." Then he turned around and left me standing there dripping wet and furious. I spent the rest of that weekend trying to make sense of what had happened. Trevor had completely overreacted to what was essentially a minor marital rough patch. Yes, I'd made some mistakes, but lots of couples go through difficult periods without resorting to divorce. His response was vindictive and extreme. When the divorce papers arrived at my office Monday morning, I was mostly just embarrassed by the scene it created. My colleagues were staring, my assistant was asking questions, and I had to deal with this humiliating situation in the middle of a busy workday. I called Trevor that afternoon, ready to be the bigger person and work toward a reasonable solution. "This is ridiculous," I told him. "You're throwing away 10 years of marriage over a temporary problem. I made some mistakes, but we can work through this if you'll stop being so dramatic about everything." "I'm not interested in working through anything," Trevor replied. "My lawyer says the papers were clear." His coldness was shocking. This was not the man I'd married. The grateful, accommodating husband who'd always been willing to compromise and forgive. Someone had clearly gotten in his ear and convinced him to take this nuclear approach. "Fine," I said. "If you want to do this the hard way, that's your choice. But don't expect me to make it easy for you. Enjoy your poor lifestyle without me. Trevor, on your $48,000 salary, you'll be living in a studio apartment within 6 months." I was confident that reality would set in quickly once Trevor realized what divorce actually meant for someone in his financial situation. He'd been dependent on my income for years, whether he wanted to admit it or not. Our house, our cars, our lifestyle, all of that was possible because of my career success. But then my lawyer called with some disturbing news. "Brittany, we need to discuss the alimony situation," she said during our first meeting. "Because you've been married over 10 years? Trevor's entitled to long-term spousal support under state law." I stared at her, certain I'd misunderstood. "What do you mean, long-term support?" "Given the length of your marriage and the income disparity, he could be entitled to alimony for several years, possibly permanent, depending on how the judge views the circumstances." This was insane. Trevor was about to be rewarded for his lack of ambition, compensated for his choice to remain in a low-paying career while I built something substantial. The system was going to punish me for being successful and supporting my lazy husband for a decade. There has to be something we can do, I told her. He's the one who refused to work on our marriage. Why should I have to pay him for destroying our relationship? But the legal reality was becoming clear. Trevor had somehow planned this perfectly, waiting until we passed the 10-year mark to file for divorce. He'd been strategic about the timing, calculating about maximizing his financial benefit from ending our marriage. I tried calling him several times, hoping to negotiate a reasonable settlement that wouldn't destroy my financial future. But Trevor refused to take my calls, routing everything through his lawyer. The man who used to apologize for disagreeing with me about dinner plans had suddenly developed a backbone at the worst possible moment. The divorce proceedings were a nightmare. Trevor's lawyer painted me as some kind of heartless career woman who neglected her marriage while pursuing selfish ambitions. They made my affair sound like a calculated betrayal instead of the natural result of years of emotional neglect from an inadequate husband. Meanwhile, Trevor was portrayed as the devoted, supportive spouse who'd sacrificed his own opportunities to help me succeed. His lawyer actually argued that Trevor had invested in my career growth by handling household responsibilities and providing emotional support during my professional advancement. It was a complete distortion of our relationship dynamic. I was the one who'd carried us financially for years. I was the one who'd made the sacrifices and hard choices necessary for long-term security. But somehow the narrative became about Trevor's contributions and my selfishness. The final settlement was devastating. Trevor walked away with nearly half of our savings, half of my retirement accounts, and a monthly alimony payment that was almost as much as his teaching salary. I had to sell our house to pay his portion of the equity, then find a smaller place I could afford on my reduced income. Trevor, meanwhile, used his windfall to buy some property outside town and set up his perfect little bachelor life. I heard through mutual friends that he quit teaching and started some online ASL business that was apparently doing well. The man who'd been content with mediocrity for 10 years suddenly became an entrepreneur the moment he got his hands on my money. My own life fell apart in ways I never could have predicted. The affair scandal damaged my professional reputation, especially once David's wife found out and started making noise at his company. David ended our relationship immediately to protect his own career, leaving me to deal with the fallout alone. I lost my job 6 months after the divorce was finalized. They claimed it was a restructuring issue, but I knew the real reason. Office affairs and messy divorces don't play well in conservative corporate environments. No matter how talented or valuable you are professionally, without my income, keeping up with the alimony payments became impossible. I had to downsize again, moving into a cramped apartment while Trevor apparently thrived in his new situation. The injustice was overwhelming. He was being rewarded for his vindictive behavior while I suffered consequences for minor mistakes. That's when I decided to confront him directly. I drove out to his new place on a Saturday afternoon, needing to make him understand how his selfish actions had destroyed my life. Trevor was living in a double-wide trailer on several acres, looking healthier and happier than I'd seen him in years. The sight of his contentment while I struggled just to survive made my anger boil over. "Look what you've done to me," I screamed at him when he answered the door. "My life is in shambles because of your vindictive, petty revenge. You've destroyed everything I worked for just because your feelings got hurt." Trevor looked at me with the same calm expression he'd worn that night in the bathroom. "You need to leave. Brittany, we have nothing to discuss. I'm not going anywhere until you understand what your selfishness has cost me. You're living off my success while I can't even afford a decent apartment. This is insane." When Trevor started to close the door, something in me snapped completely. Years of frustration and injustice came pouring out. "You pathetic loser," I shouted. "You were nothing before me, and you'll be nothing after me. I should have listened to everyone who told me I was too good for you. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of vindictive, manipulative person you really are." Trevor called the police after that visit. I received a formal warning about harassment and had to agree to stay away from his property. The humiliation was complete. Now I was being treated like some kind of dangerous stalker for simply trying to communicate with my ex-husband. But I wasn't finished. If Trevor wanted to play hardball, I could do that too. I reached out to his family members, explaining my side of the story and helping them understand how Trevor had manipulated the situation. His cousin Marcus had always liked me, and I was able to help him see how Trevor's new attitude toward women was becoming problematic. He's turned into this bitter, cynical person. I explained to Marcus. The way he talks about women now, the paranoid things he believes about relationships. It's not healthy. Someone needs to help him see that not all women are out to get him. I also made sure Trevor's professional contacts understood the kind of person they were dealing with. Anonymous messages to his former colleagues, social media posts about his character, careful documentation of his controlling and vindictive behavior during our marriage. People deserve to know the truth about Trevor's transformation from supportive husband to calculating manipulator. The harassment campaign was more successful than I'd hoped. Trevor was forced to install security cameras and change his phone number. Several family members stopped speaking to him after learning about his treatment of me during the divorce. His paranoid behavior escalated to the point where he was carrying pepper spray and filing police reports over perfectly normal attempts at communication. But Trevor's response was typically extreme. Instead of recognizing that his actions had consequences, he doubled down on his victim narrative. He actually tried to get a restraining order, claiming I was threatening his safety by exercising my right to free speech about our relationship. The legal system sided with him again. Of course. I was prohibited from contacting Trevor directly or visiting his property, which effectively silenced my ability to tell my side of the story. Meanwhile, Trevor continued benefiting from the financial arrangements that had destroyed my stability. Now, 3 years later, I'm still dealing with the consequences of Trevor's vindictive choices. My career never recovered from the scandal he created. My financial situation remains precarious because of the ongoing alimony obligations. My social circle was destroyed when people took sides during the divorce proceedings. Trevor, meanwhile, has apparently built a successful online business and moved on with his life. He's probably telling people that he's the victim in our story, that he escaped from an unhappy marriage and found his independence. The narrative he's constructed completely ignores his own failures as a husband and his calculating approach to the divorce. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Trevor had been willing to work on our problems instead of immediately jumping to divorce. If he'd been more understanding about my needs, more supportive of my career pressures, more willing to accept that marriages go through difficult phases. But Trevor chose the nuclear option, and now we're both living with the consequences. The most frustrating part is how everyone seems to think Trevor is the hero of this story. People see his quiet demeanor and supportive teaching career and assume he must have been the innocent party. They don't understand the subtle ways he controlled our relationship, the pressure he put on me about children, the emotional withdrawal that drove me to seek connection elsewhere. I made mistakes. Certainly, I should have been more direct about my unhappiness, should have insisted on marriage counseling, should have ended things cleanly before getting involved with David. But Trevor's response was disproportionate and vindictive, designed to punish me as severely as possible rather than actually resolve our problems. The system rewarded his manipulative behavior while punishing me for being human, for having needs that weren't being met in our marriage. Now Trevor gets to play the wronged husband while I'm portrayed as the villain who destroyed our happy home. It's a complete distortion of what actually happened between us. I'm still hoping that someday people will understand the full picture. We'll see how Trevor's calculating behavior and emotional manipulation contributed to our marriage's failure. Until then, I'm focused on rebuilding my life and moving forward, despite the obstacles he created. But I'll never forget the injustice of how this situation was handled, or forgive Trevor for choosing revenge over reconciliation.